where there's room for agreement between the Foucauldian type position and the classical liberal position is precisely that in order to keep society as free as possible, you need to avoid alignments between these sort of cultural norms which can potentially be oppressive and state power.
From Jordan Peterson to Stephen Hicks, many defenders of liberal institutions like freedom of speech and freedom of conscience attack postmodernism as a threat to a free society. As with terms like capitalism and social justice, the meaning of postmodernism is quite unclear. It isn't so much a coherent ideological movement, but a loose group of ideas which focus on scepticism towards established ideas, social constructs, and grand theories of any kind. Jean-François Lyotard, the man credited with introducing the term postmodernism to the forefront of philosophy, posited that we should be inherently suspicious of grand meta-narratives, in particular the way they're used towards the goal of legitimising political institutions, practices, laws, ethics, and ways of thinking. On one hand, this often leads postmodernists to question and reconceptualise ideas and language in ways that liberals don't like. The most notorious example is the word power. Postmodernist thinkers often define certain non-violent actions like words and social status as power, rather than limiting the term to coercion, as many liberals do. But on the other hand, scepticism towards grand narratives within postmodern thought has often been directed in terms of criticism at Marxism and Christianity. Likewise, the suspicion towards established ideas and the assumptions underpinning them can complement liberal scepticism towards the state or certain policy proposals. Indeed, postmodern scepticism of reason and rationality don't seem to conflict with free market economic concepts like, for example, the knowledge problem. When Mises and Hayek articulated the problems of a centrally planned economy, they did so by illustrating the limits of rational planning. This was precisely in contravention to the explicitly rationalist case for state economic planning articulated by Marx and Lenin. One of the original postmodern thinkers, an arch-enemy of the anti-postmodernists, is Michel Foucault. Foucault's career is often remembered for his critiques of rationalism, of established social power structures, and of the weaponisation of language. But Foucault was also a sceptic of the state, and the ways in which government perpetually invent new ways to justify its political authority. Many postmodern thinkers argue that Foucault became more sympathetic towards liberal ideas towards the end of his career. So is it time to re-examine the compatibility of postmodernism and liberalism? On this episode of Moral Sentiments, I'll be discussing this with Mark Pennington, a Professor of Political Economy and Public Policy at King's College London and a member of the IEA's Academic Advisory Council. So Mark, thank you very much for joining me. So you've got this man, Foucault, and his school of thought in postmodernism. It is considered by many in our movement who are committed to the liberal tradition of rationalism, you know, in the image of the likes of Locke and Mill, that this man is the enemy. He is an enemy of our movement. But you disagree. You think there's something to synthesise here. Why do you think that?
I do, and the reason is that not all people within the liberal tradition are themselves rationalists. So if you think of one of the most influential liberal thinkers in the last 100 years certainly has got to be F.A. Hayek. And most of Hayek's writings are explicitly anti-rationalistic. So they are, within a sense, within the Enlightenment tradition, but they're also emphasizing the limits of that tradition. So Hayek talks a great deal about the limits of human reason, or he refers to actually a phrase from David Hume, which is about using reason to understand the limits of reason. So many of these ideas are about thinking through the limits of Enlightenment rationality and recognizing that certain forms of liberalism, which are rationalistic, can actually be threats to freedom, properly understood. And I think there's a space to synthesize Hayekian type ideas or anti-rationalist streams of liberalism. You could also think of thinkers like Michael Oakeshott within this tradition, with some of Foucault's anti-rationalism, and actually other people who are broadly within what people consider to be the sort of postmodern stream in political thought.
And just briefly to give an overview, what exactly is postmodernism? this word gets bandied around by supporters and critics all the time, but yeah, a bit like capitalism. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about postmodernism?
Well, I mean, it's important to recognize there isn't any one set of ideas that you could say amount to postmodernism. So different thinkers who are broadly put within that overall sort of grouping actually have different sorts of ideas. So Foucault is often put in that group. Derrida is often put in that group. There are various feminist thinkers that are put in that group. You even have people claiming that critical race theorists or queer theorists, all of these kind of groupings are often lumped together within the postmodernist category. And that is not totally wrong in the sense there are some common themes within all those different thinkers and different sort of schools of thought. But it's also unfortunate because there are significant differences as well between them that get masked when they all get lumped together into this kind of category. If I was to say what the overarching theme of what people call postmodernism is, it would be a kind of radically skeptical stance about notions of scientific truth. So it's not denying the idea. I mean, people often say it denies any notion of truth. I don't think that's right. I think what it is a kind of radical skepticism that you should always be aware that what you think is true may actually be a product of various traditions or ideologies that are actually historically contingent. So it's not saying that there isn't truth. It's saying that our notions of what we think are true are often conditioned by these kind of forces, if you like, and we should always be aware of that.
And when you do describe it in those terms, it seems quite intuitive to me how it could be very compatible with a liberal school of thought. You know, we are unfortunately fairly marginal and heterodox in the discourse at the moment, but we are very, very sceptical of a lot of the sort of common understandings, the established ways of doing things, you know, of dominant tellings of history. And one particular area you already highlighted, you know, Hayek's view on the knowledge problem and the bounds of human rationality, at least, you know, sort of top-down abstract rationality. But Foucault talks about the state in a very interesting way, doesn't he? About the evolution and the history of the state, and how a lot of the myths that we ascribe to our state, particularly in Western countries which have, you know, just been far more successful in recent history than others, and we talk about these big breakthroughs for democracy, for republicanism in the United States, revolutions, civil wars, world wars, whatever you want to talk about. But he has a far more sort of pessimistic, skeptical view about a lot of these things. He talks about democracy, for example, as something that's not driven by, you know, an ideological desire to free people, to have accountable government, but through political necessity, the necessity of the state to survive. And that's the terms on which we should view the state's actions. Doesn't that seem to be, you know, a highly liberal way of viewing the states? One that is very much echoed by lots of liberal thinkers, particularly the more radical ones.
I mean, it certainly could be. So one way of thinking about this would be, so Foucault's concerned with the way that people use what he calls discourses as a way of exerting power over other agents. So I think what you referred to there in terms of the state, what he might be interested in is thinking how people within state structures or who have positions of power within them use discourses or tropes or forms of argumentation to effectively justify their position, to justify the fact that they are exercising power over others. So you could think of various economic discourses. For example, the notion that when you have some kind of a recession, that we need to have aggregate demand management or something of that kind. That's a discourse about the need to stabilize the market system. Now, he wouldn't necessarily say that that is untrue, okay? But what he would be concerned about is the notion that if there are agents who gain power from this discourse, they could be interested in perpetuating it, irrespective of whether it's true. So if I benefit from the belief that others have in my expertise, then I'm going to be acting in a way which tries to, if you like, cover up the limitations of my expertise to maintain my power. And there could be lots of areas within contemporary states where people have these discourses of expertise, which are actually highly contestable, but that people take for granted and that allow public agents and other actors as well to exercise a form of power over them. So if you think of, there are all kinds of areas, the power to regulate food, for example, assumes that there is a scientific expertise about which foods are healthy or unhealthy that can enable bureaucrats to exercise power over other actors, whether it's consumers, manufacturers, or whoever. So he's very much concerned with the way agents justify themselves through these kinds of discourses. But it's also important to recognize that his is not a theory that claims that the discourses were necessarily invented for that purpose. So it's not a totally cynical view, which is almost like a kind of Marxist reductionism, where whatever theories that people have are the ones that people invented to justify their position. Yes. It's not like that. What he's pointing out is that these ideas, they could almost arise or become established through accident. But once they are established, they then create interests that agents may have in perpetuating. So it's not a kind of false consciousness type theory in the way that Marxism would be.
And you can just think of so many of these, the way that they use doublespeak in a lot of sense. When they talk about investment, they mean taking money from taxpayers and spending it on the thing they want to spend it on. When they talk about food standards, often in the context of Brexit trade, they are assuming, as you say, that you know, I don't want what they consider to be lower standard food, that even if I did want it, I would be misinformed, and that therefore they have to look after it for me. And this type of view, particularly, you know, the term democracy just gets bandied around as an argument ender, doesn't it? And that assumes a heck of a lot about what the government has the power to do and on what basis it does. But this is one of Foucault's key points, which is that when certain sorts of discourses get very well established, there's all kinds of taken for granted assumptions that are embedded within them about the nature of people, about who is exercising power over whom, that people just forget or don't realize are unstated assumptions. So when we use this kind of everyday language about the way democracy functions or the authorities that politicians should have, these don't often have some kind of scientific basis. They're just taken for granted as part of a kind of established mode of thought. And what he wants to do is to get people to question some of those assumptions, to, you know, problematize, which would be the word that people in that tradition use. Yeah. And one of the things that sort of jumped out to me when I was looking at how Foucault's arguments could map quite nicely onto or complement some liberal ideas, particularly radical liberal ideas, is it seems that a lot of it is very similar to the type of arguments that get laid out by Murray Rothbard in his sort of short essay, Anatomy of the State. Rothbard goes through, you know, saying what is the state, what the state isn't, and tries to take some of these terms and say, well, what you mean by tax is forcibly taking somebody's property. What you mean by, you know, state intervention is forcing someone to do or not to do something dependent on a particular set of politicians' preferences. Taking these, you know, these words, as you say, that we just use as common discourse and are sort of broadly accepted as being established as if, you know, they were equivalent to the claim, you know, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, and just actually explaining what they mean in reality. But the question is, how far down are we willing to go with that skepticism? And, you know, if you take a radically skeptical view of the state, you can see how that complements the liberal mindset. If you take a radically skeptical view of even things like very basic language, are we not getting into some dangerous territory there that liberals ought not to like?
Well, there's a lot in what you've just said. So let me take the Murray Rothbard point to start off with. So yes, Foucault would be concerned with the way people use certain sort of terminology or discourse potentially to disguise the underlying nature of what's happening. But it's also important to recognize, and I think this is where people in his tradition, and certainly I think in the kind of liberalism I would want to defend, they'd also be skeptical about whether we can use terms like coercion in the way that is often used by liberals. So when liberals talk about coercion, certainly classical liberals, and libertarians, they're emphasizing direct forms of coercion, like violence, hitting someone without their permission, stealing their stuff, taking their property. People in the Foucauldian tradition also emphasize the way that various forms of power circulate through these discourses in a way that can exercise what people who are subject to them experience as a form of coercion, even though it isn't the kind of coercion associated with direct violence.
Yes.
So if you are a gay person in a society which is basically hostile in its discursive structures to the notion of homosexuality, you are going to experience a form of unfreedom, which isn't captured simply by speaking about coercion as direct violence. If all your opportunities are heavily constrained by the fact that if people knew this about you, they wouldn't deal with you, they would ostracize you, or they would treat you in other kinds of ways, then you're not really free. So freedom on this view can't just be about direct forms of coercion or violence. There are all these, what the postmodernists and Foucauldians would refer to as decentered forms of power that need to be taken into account when we're thinking about issues to do with freedom. Now, having said that, I think the way this can connect back to an analysis of the state is to think that many of some of the worst forms of oppression that have affected groups like gay people, people of various racial or ethnic minorities, or women, to take a huge group, relate to the way that these kind of norms or discourses interact with state power. So it's one thing to be in a society where, if you like, the norms or culture are prejudiced against gay people or against women. And that's going to make life for people within those groups more difficult than it otherwise would be. But it's going to be an awful lot more difficult if those norms are also legitimized or enforced through coercive powers that the state does possess. So it's going to be even worse if you're gay or if you're a woman in a society where not only is there a kind of cultural hostility or suspicion to these groups, but where there are legal prohibitions put on you against that prevent you from owning property, that prevent you from expressing your sexual orientation in public, these sorts of things. So I think the interesting way that a Foucauldian and a classical liberal analysis could sort of come together would be in looking at the interaction between state power and these kind of cultural norms, and how the state can sort of reinforce cultural prejudices or prevent them from being challenged or broken down.
And that one particular idea that you just mentioned, which I think is a very important one, and I think is what people tend to criticise from the more right-wing side, perhaps, of the liberal spectrum, or the right of the culture war in general. That idea of sort of what they would consider to be a bit of a bait and switch when it comes to some very basic words that are very important to the nature of discourse in general. So coercion, for example, I could be having an argument with somebody about anything in particular, a particular policy, a philosophical discussion. We could be using the term coercion, but in very different ways. If they are a student of Foucault and I don't agree with that particular interpretation, we're using those two things in very different ways. And that struck me as one area where that incompatibility seems to be much more sort of palpable between the two. So your academic career is mostly spent talking about political economy, I believe I'm right in saying. Mm-hmm. And that is a particular field of study where liberal scholars have done probably much more work than anybody else to really nail down the truth of this stuff. And political economy is all about trade-offs. It's all about saying, you can't just say the thing you want and wish it into reality. There are necessary implications you have to deal with. There are trade-offs you have to deal with. You have to deal with time, scarcity, all that stuff. If you've just laid out the argument that, maybe Foucault's right about the oppression of gay people, even if it's not necessarily state coercion as you would see it. But it's much worse to have an overactive state perpetuating these things and making it much worse. I would completely agree with that. But those two things are traded off against each other. If you have a small state and you respect the rights of individuals, a lot of people are going to choose to use those rights, however much I may not like it, to be homophobic, to discriminate against gay people, for example. That seems like a direct trade-off, and one that can't be squared between the key ideas of something like a classical liberal political economy and Foucault's state of, sort of...
They can often be eroded by capitalism, by market forces. So if you think about Schumpeter's idea of capitalism being about creative destruction, it's about often radical innovations. And those innovations, they don't only result in radical technological change, they often also result in cultural change. So you get washing machines invented, or the pill invented, or whatever, and that suddenly opens up new opportunities for women or for other groups that otherwise were not there.
The printing press, I guess, is a very famous example, right?
And it also works to destabilize social constructions about what people's roles should be in society. So I think that's another area where, if you're talking about sort of keeping the state out of things, then the very dynamism of capitalism can actually work to facilitate empowerment for various groups in society that have previously been disempowered, by creating more opportunities and enabling them to escape from ties which in the past would have been even more constraining if they were women, gay people, or members of various kind of minority groups. So I think that's the way to think about this. I think on the point about coercion, I think it is possible to say there's a bright line between certain things that genuinely are real violence, like hitting people, stealing from people, and these other forms of oppression. But at the same time, recognizing that in practical terms, for what people, often pejoratively describe as thinking about people's lived experience, that this line is often quite vague. If you are in a society where you're going to face all kind of sanctions because of who you are or because of the views you express, this can feel an awful lot like coercion. And it's quite strange for, if you like, certain types of right-winger to say that we shouldn't take this coercion, this form of coercion, seriously, when these are precisely the arguments they're making about the problem of cancel culture. So cancel culture is a manifestation of that kind of decentered power, where people are afraid to express their views because of the consequences that may follow in terms of ostracism, whatever may be the case. So yes, that isn't direct violence, but my word, it can affect whether or not you feel like you're free.
Definitely.
In an academic setting or in other sorts of settings as well.
But doesn't that just sort of restate the case for drawing a very clear line in the language we use as well? So I completely agree with everything you just said. I think liberals in general, whatever their disposition, don't pay enough attention to the type of non-state coercion that people can face. And I agree, we should end racism as much as we can, whether that's voluntary or state, absolutely. But to end cancel culture as well, perhaps. But isn't it important that even if we acknowledge that, we do make it very clear in our language and call out anybody that attempts to muddy those two things together, that they are very different, and we might say they're both bad and we might want to fight against both, but that they are not the same? And isn't that perhaps the objection to a lot of the modern day the modern postmodernists, so to speak, is that they do intentionally muddy the waters there with terms like structural violence, perhaps?
Well, I think that's right, but it's important here, if we're talking about Foucault specifically, to say that he actually does make such a bright line distinction. So not so much in his earlier works, but there's a late work, which is now very heavily cited, which is called The Subject and Power, where he distinguishes very clearly between what he calls states of domination or unfreedom, which would be something like slavery, direct violence, and what he calls power relations, which can only ever be exercised over free agents. Now, what he's talking about there is precisely the type of power that faces people where they're in situations where their views or their behavior or whatever are minority in a certain sense, and people are frightened of the consequences of revealing something about themselves in public because of the consequences. And what he wants to say is actually, this is precisely the kind of situation where people have to be entrepreneurial. any entrepreneur, whether it's in the economic sphere or if you like in the cultural or moral sphere, often is going to be someone who's coming up with ideas or behaviors or standards that are contrary to the norm. Entrepreneurs are people who challenge norms, and initially their ideas are often treated as ridiculous or bizarre. And it's only at a later point when those ideas have been put into practice that people gradually start to change their mind. And that's as true when you're thinking about norms about gender, sexuality, all these sorts of things, as it is about economic practices. So yeah, you can maintain this bright line distinction, and I think somebody like Foucault would do that, but at the same time appreciate the kinds of situation that people may be in when they face these other forms of power, and also the scope that there is for people to challenge those forms of power by acting in a kind of entrepreneurial vein.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just one thing I wanted to turn to finally before we end, which is that unlike plenty of, well, most, I would argue, thinkers who are, you would call broadly, left-coded or left-wing progressive and whatever, there's not much of a paternalistic streak in Foucault, is there? It is key, I guess, from the progressive era in the United States, whose ideology and Fabianism in the UK, the ideology runs through to most of today's centre left. There's a lot of paternalism. We were talking about food standards earlier. They are assuming a right on your behalf because they know more than you to tell you what food you can eat, for example. He really despises that, and he also seems to me to not like the way that, particularly sort of mercantilist period, sort of as the Enlightenment is really unfolding and having an effect on the way states behave, the way that they use sort of statistical and logical rationalizations to justify the policies they embark on. That's quite an important difference, not one you see dissented against as strongly too much on the left. Do you think that is a very important area that his contribution can give, not just to us, but also to people on the left who adopt these paternalistic ideas?
I think that's right. So he is very critical of what he refers to as pastoral power. And pastoral power is basically the type of power that used to be exercised by the church over the flock, that the flock had to be guided by the pastor in all aspects of their life. And the pastor, in exercising power over people, tries to generate feelings of guilt, which mean that the subjects actually enforce the kind of power on themselves. They obey the pastor's rules even when the pastor isn't in their house or actually directly observing what they're doing. And he claims that that kind of power that used to be exercised by the church increasingly came to be exercised by people who claim to have scientific expertise, that the scientists become the new pastors, claiming to guide people on the correct path about the foods they eat, about all kinds of behavioral practices. So that is certainly an area where he is anti-paternalistic, or at least because he's skeptical of all truth claims, he would at least want to be skeptical of paternalism.
Mark, that was very interesting. Thank you very much for joining us. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And to all the viewers at home, if you enjoyed that video, please give it a like. And if you want to see more content like this, please go to the IA London YouTube and give us a subscribe.